Welcome to Trinity Wesleyan Church Online. We are so glad to have you here today. We've been praying for you, and we're excited for what God is going to be speaking to you today. When I was in first and second grade, I used to love doing Mad Minutes. And basically, it was a sheet of math problems that you would go through and try to figure out the answer as fast as you can. Basically, they gave you a minute to do about 20 or 25 math problems. And sometimes they would have the super Mad Minutes where you have 100 problems and you have to do it in like 5 minutes or something. I don't remember exactly, but I remember I was the fastest. I was the fastest in the West. I was the fastest in my classroom. I was the fastest. I was fast. And there was times where I made my own problems on the back because I was just done. I got my whole sheet done and I still had extra time. So I would just keep doing it. And I loved multiplication. I loved doing all the multiplication. I knew my times tables. You go through 1 times 1, 1 times 2, 1 times 3. Then you go down to the 2s, 2 times 1, 2 times 2, 2 times 3. All the way down, you go through 9 times 1, 9 times 2, 9 times 3. And I knew all these answers because I had flashcards. I did all these different things. I did math books. I had fun with math. And some people in my class didn't take the time to get to the basics. They didn't start to memorize these numbers. And so I was very fast at it. I was fast because I practiced. Then math started with letters, and I was done with math because it wasn't fun anymore. And I did so well in algebra that I took it twice. It wasn't because I was bad at math, but it's because I stopped practicing. It's because I stopped trying. And the effort that I was putting in didn't equal the reward. It wasn't fun anymore, so I stopped trying. I didn't go back to the basics. I didn't try anymore. So in this series, Money Matters, we are going back to the basics. We're going back to the basics of money. The matters pertaining to money is what we're talking about. And money isn't scary when we pull back the curtain and when we see what the truth actually is. It's not scary when God is our provider, because he gave Abraham a large dream in his old age and said that, Abraham, you're going to have a son. And he came to him at 86 and told him he was going to have a son. And it didn't happen until he was 99 years old. He was given a large dream, but then God came through and provided a son in his old age. And then God asked Abraham to sacrifice his only son. He has his only son, and he says, Abraham, I need you to sacrifice him. And he came through. God asked Abraham to sacrifice his only son. So he was obedient. It was difficult because he knew all the struggles to get to this point where he had no sons, no kids. But he was obedient because God had come through. Abraham was obedient, but as the knife was coming down, God says, wait, don't lay a hand on the boy. And he looks over and he said, there's the ram in the thicket. And he sees the ram in the thicket. And that ram might have been there before, but Abraham didn't realize that it was an option because he wasn't told about it yet, because he was obedient to God. Even if there was a ram stuck in a thicket, that he was being obedient to sacrifice his son, but God came through and provided, and that's where God was called Jireh, Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. Money is not scary when God is our master. He's a good, gracious, loving master, but money is a bad master. The master of money makes people selfish and greedy and evil. Again, money is not the root of all evil, but it is a root of all types of evil. It's not all evil, but it's a root of a lot of different types of evil. But when you're focused on money, when money is your master, you're focused on what's next, not on what God is giving you. You're focused on what you don't have yet. You're focused on what you want to come. When you're focused on God, it's the total opposite. You're not focused on the next thing. You're focused on what God is already giving you today. You're focused on what you do have, that you can be sufficient with what you have, and that God has provided everything that you need. You can say, what I have is enough. What God has given me is enough. Jireh, he is enough, that he is our provider, that what he gives is enough. Like the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, and they were given manna, and they were given manna every single day. They went out and they scooped it up and they put it in their little buckets and they had their manna, and it wasn't even good. It's not amazing cuisine, but it's something that sustains. It wasn't great. It wasn't what they wanted to eat, but it sustained them. It's not extra. They didn't have just manna laying around. If they tried to take anything else, it would spoil by the next day. It's like saying to yourself, God, what you've given is enough. Even if I don't like it, what you give is enough. That you are Jireh. Money is not scary when we take care of our flock. When we step back, we gather everything we have. We check to see if any of our flock is sick, if they need tended to, if there's any of our flock that's wandering out, and we bring them back together. When you do this and you check your income, you check your expenses, you get rid of the wandering money and you stick to the 80-10-10 rule, where your 80% is expenses, 10% is savings or investing, and 10% is tithe. You're not meant to be at your limit. You're not meant to always be pushing the envelope. You're meant to have some wiggle room, have some margin built in, where you're planning for the next few months and not just planning for the next meal. You tend to your flock for their safety and those around you. And being an adult means that you are responsible for your own money. No one else is going to be responsible for your money. And when we take all these things, we can't be afraid of money, but you can take all these things, you can put them into your head, you can write them down, you can make a plan, but if you don't actually do it, your life isn't going to change. Your money outlook is going to stay the same. That goes for matters pertaining to money, but really it has to do with anything in life. You can make a plan, you can have a good idea, but if you never do it, nothing will ever change. And realizing that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and his ways are higher than our ways. It says in the Bible, the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. You remember Solomon from last week. He is the most wise man ever. His best wisdom doesn't compare to the foolishness of God. Isn't that good? I mean, don't we serve an amazing, wise, all-knowing God, and he knows what's best for us? So when we trust in him, we're not trusting in our wisdom, but we are trusting in the wisdom of God, and our wisest wisdom is still not even in comparison to the foolishness of God. But still we ask ourselves, is it enough? Is 80% enough to live on? I have needs, also known as wants, that I need you to supply for, God. But anything outside of food, anything outside of clothing is just extra blessing. Anything that is needed beyond food or clothing is not trusting God. This is where it gets difficult. It's not easy to take the next step. It's a step of faith, like me in the dark, where I can't see in the dark. My eyes don't adjust. It's like a step of faith. You don't know where that foot is going to be, if you're going to be putting on the floor or tripping over a toy. You don't know where your foot is going to land, but you take that step. You take that step. There was this thing called the leap of faith. It was part of a high ropes course. And when Jen and I had first gotten married, we went to the youth camp, and Jen was the youth pastor, and I was there helping at the youth camp. And they had this high rope called the leap of faith. And what you do is you climb up this telephone pole. It's about 25 feet up. and you're just climbing up on giant staples, and you're just climbing up and you're holding on, and then you get on top of it. You get on top of this foam pole, and then you jump for this trapeze bar. It's a leap of faith. And what I was doing when I went up there, and you're harnessed in, you got a rope attached to, so if you fall, you're not going to fall 25 feet. It'll catch you. But when I went to jump, I jumped and I caught the trapeze bar, but I barely missed, and the back rope caught around my arm and actually pulled tight, and I had a rope burn. And I get down. I knew if I would have actually told Jen that I got hurt, she would have never done it. And so I didn't say anything. I'm just like, yep, you got it, Jen. I'm fine. But it's a leap of faith. You don't know what's going to happen, but God always catches you. 80% is enough to live on. And 80% is the easy part. And as bad as it sounds, that's easy. Cutting expenses, bringing in more income. That's the easy part. And that's easier said than done. But really, if you've done your homework in this past week, in the past couple weeks, evaluating your whole life is not easy. Between the Sundays, if you did your homework, if you tended to your flock, you probably had some hard conversations with your family, with your spouse. You made some hard decisions. You had a hard look at your life choices. How do I live without fill in the blank? How do I live without internet? How do I live without my phone? How do I live without cable or video games or new clothes or eating out? How do I live without that? And as hard as it is to say, that's the easy part. But is living paycheck to paycheck fun? Doesn't extra money sound great? I mean, it sounds amazing. If I just had extra money, that would be great. But what's been happening is you've probably been reevaluating life circumstances. You've been going back through, what are the choices I've made? How can I get myself out? How has God provided in the past, and what steps do I need to take in the future? And last week, I also should have clarified. In talking about a burden versus a load, specifically this series is about talking about the load portion. Talked about Galatians 6, where it says that everybody should carry their own load, but you need to help each other carry each other's burdens. This series is about the load portion, the part that you can take care of. I'm not talking about burdens. I'm not talking about medical bills, fires, death in the family. There are things we cannot control, and that's why we're called to carry each other's burdens. You didn't ask for it, but this whole series is focused on the load portion, the things you can control, the personal choices, the money that you spend. This whole series is on your personal choices. And today we're talking about the fun one, and I totally mean that. We're talking about tithing. This is the fun one for me because there's blessing in tithing. And it's not saying that the blessing is always going to come in the form of money. It's not a prosperity gospel, but the blessing comes in many different ways. This is not to trick you, but it's to help you find the blessing that God wants to give you. And tithe, if you go back in the Hebrew language, tithe actually means tenth. That's why when we talk about tithes and offerings, it's 10% for tithes. Tithes and offerings are actually two separate things, where tithe is 10%. That's exactly what it means. Tithe equals 10. And offering is anything extra. God, you've asked for 10%, here's 10%. Tithe is commanded. Offering is giving more than tithe. Maybe you had some extra because God had blessed you in some way. So I want to worship God by giving extra. That's an offering. You're offering extra. And many people in our culture don't believe that tithing is actually biblical, but tithing is biblical. And we're going to go through the Bible pretty quickly and talk about it. And we're going to go right to the beginning. Right to the beginning, the creation story, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were the man and the first female. And they had Cain and Abel. One of them, Abel, brought the best portion of his flock to the Lord. Not just a portion, but the best part. the best part, the first part, the best part. And he set aside that to thank God for the harvest that had happened. And most of us, we don't get a harvest once a year. Like they probably got a harvest once a year from their crops or from their animals that they had. We don't get paid once a year, but we get a harvest weekly, every other week, or monthly. Typically, we don't get a 1 year salary, just here it is, that's all you get for the year. But we reap the harvest of God's blessings not just once, but many times a year. In Genesis 4, it says, in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked down with favor on Abel and his offering, but Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. We look at each of these. Cain brought some of the fruits as an offering. Abel brought the fat portions from the firstborn, not from the runt, not the smallest, but the biggest, the baddest, the strongest. He brought the best part. He brought the biggest, the best, the first. And the Lord looked with favor on Abel, but he didn't look with favor on Cain. And Cain was jealous, and eventually Cain went and killed Abel in a field because he was so jealous. And it didn't go well for Cain. But the beginning practice of tithing happened right there. That's the first thing. God asked for them to give a portion, and one of them brought the best, and one of them brought just some. That was the beginning practice of tithing, and is carried through the Israelite tradition for generations and generations. This concept of first fruits that we are going to talk about, or tithing, was brought back up after the Israelites were freed from 40 years of Egyptian slavery. So we go from Genesis, and now we're in Leviticus chapter 27. It says, a tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. A tithe, a first fruit from the land. The first fruit, the best, the stuff that has the most nutrients. But everything belongs to God anyway. And what he's saying here is what God gives us is holy. It's from him. If God gives it, it's holy. That he is Jireh, he is provider. And it was already a command, but Moses was just bringing this back to the Israelites, that God is the one that brought them from Egypt. That God is the one who gives them everything. So when they think about God, they give the best because God is the one that provides what they need. And this continued as God commanded them to build a temple and to have priests. Tithes were an act of worship. They were brought to the temple, but also these tithes supported the temple, the maintenance of the temple. They supported the priests. And God commanded the temple and the priests, but then the priests were given jobs to oversee the worship of God. So instead of them working the ground, they weren't tending cattle or they weren't tending sheep. They were paid through giving of tithes. It's a way to honor God when they come in and they worship and they say, God, thank you for giving me what we have. Here's a portion back to you. But it's a way to support the temple and the priests. And people say a lot, pastors only work on Sundays. And really that's as true as NFL players only work on Sundays. Obviously that's not true. There's more than meets the eye. There's the practice, there's the research, the studying, all that stuff. But we're going to keep moving through the Bible. In the book of Malachi, it's towards the end of the Old Testament, some of the minor prophets, in chapter 3, God is telling his prophet Malachi these words to tell these people. He's telling them that they haven't kept their commands, and they say, how haven't we kept our commands? How haven't we done this? And then God specifically brings this up, and he says that his people are robbing him. They say, how are we robbing you? In Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, it says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. Again, this is God telling the people through the prophet Malachi, bring the whole tithe, 10, into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, the Lord Almighty says, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to store it. These people are robbing God, but they're also robbing themselves. They're also robbing themselves because God said that when we test him in this, that he's going to pour out so much blessing that we're not going to have room to store it. I'm not talking about gold. I'm not talking about riches, but I'm saying that every single thing that we need is going to be provided. We are robbing ourselves when we don't tithe. There's blessing in giving to God. And some people will say that this is only talked about in the Old Testament, but it's not just talked about in the Old Testament. Now we get to the Gospels. We get to Jesus now. Jesus talks about it in Matthew 23:23. We're in the middle of the 7 woes to the Pharisees. He says woes as in trouble or things that you're doing wrong. And I say woe as in woe, back up, you're about to be in trouble. But he's in the middle of the 7 woes that he's telling these Pharisees. And he's telling these religious leaders what they need to be careful of. So Matthew 23:23, it says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth, or a tithe, of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." Just because you're tithing doesn't mean that you're following Jesus. And that's a, whoa, watch out, we're about to be in trouble to us. Just because you're tithing doesn't mean you're following Jesus. And there's 2 groups of people here in this passage. People who don't tithe and are doing the justice, the mercy, and the faithfulness. And there's those who are tithing and not doing justice, mercy, and faithfulness. It's a whoa, watch out to us. Just because you tithe doesn't mean you're following God. But just because you follow justice, mercy, and faithfulness doesn't mean you're following God. Both are important. And one is more important, but he's saying both of these are important. You need to do both. Practice justice, mercy, and faithfulness, but also tithe. And here's what it comes down to. Here's what it comes down to. Tithing is something that Jesus understood not to be an issue, but a lot of times we make it an issue. But you make $100, $10 goes to God or the church. You make $587, $58 goes to God or the church. I remember when I was younger, I was not a tither, and my parents would say, okay, here's $10. You need to keep $1 so that you give it to the church. We weren't forced to tithe, but we kind of tithe sometimes when I had it, when I felt like it. This was when I was younger, like middle school. Here's $10, I'll give $1 to the church. Make me feel good. But I was sort of brought up in it. My parents tithed. But Jen, on the other hand, she did not grow up tithing. She was not brought up in it. And when I brought this up to her, not saying that I was perfect, but when I started making more money, I started tithing. I didn't want to tithe, and Jen didn't want to tithe when we first started dating, but then we started tithing. I said, it's just something we have to do that God calls us to do, and this is when we were dating, engaged, and then we tithe. It's part of our finances is that we tithe. And after much time, there's a story of a relative. I'm going to keep it relatively vague. There's a story of a relative of ours, and they were jealous when God would give us things. When God would give us things, they were jealous that Jen and I have kids. That a random $5,000 comes in to help us pay for hospital bills when Ellie was born. Someone came to this person who was jealous and said, Jen and Aaron tithe. They give money back to God, and God blesses them because of it. This person who gave this godly wisdom was not even a Christian. But they see the faithfulness of Jen and I, but they also see the faithfulness of God through it. It's a blessing because it's also a witness back to God. And God says, test me in this and see that I will throw open the floodgates of heaven. Now, we're not supposed to test God in any other way, There's many times where people tried to test him, and Jesus used scripture and said, you're not supposed to test the Lord your God. But here in scripture it says, test me in this. God says to test him. He says, try it and see what happens. It's the only place that it says to test God. You try to test God, you don't want to because you're going to learn a lesson. But he says here, test me and see what happens. If you realize that God is your provider, you're content with what God gives you, and you've structured your life to live within your means. And there's a reason that we went in this order in this series, because they build on each other. But this is what God says, test me in this. Give me your tithe and see if I won't bless you. And this is not a raise for me. Yes, it goes to the church. It's not a raise for me. It's not for me to get a pool. It's not for me to get a private jet. But this is for you only. And yes, the church is going to benefit, but the only thing we're going to be raising in our budget this year will be to give back more to our community. And when you give, the community gets better. When I came in last year, we were giving about 2% of what came in directly back to the community. This year, we're almost at 5%. And next year, we're going to be going to 10%. Next church year, we're going to be going to 10% back to the community to unleash hope. When you tithe 10%, the church can also tithe 10% back to the community because we want to unleash hope. Say you work 40 hours a week. The first 4 hours of income go to God. The first thing that you spend goes to God. In everything that you do the best, the first. The best part of what you have, you give it first. And there are ways to give to the church. There's a box inside. It says give here, or you can give at the drive-in building. You can give by mail. You can send your money to us through the mail. You can go online to trinitywesleyande.com/giving. But basically what God is calling us to is to become tithers. So what I want us to do is to take some time right now to figure out what that number is. You write down, what are my expenses? What do I make? Where's the 10%? What's 10% of what I make? And start giving back to God. But when we give to God, God multiplies. He doesn't subtract. He multiplied the fish and the loaves twice. He multiplied the manna. He multiplied the fish when the disciples were fishing. When you are obedient and you do what God is asking you to do, He multiplies. Things go further. You have what you need. And there's been many, many times, countless stories of Jen and I. If you're curious, ask us. But there's countless stories where God comes through, so a lot of times at the last minute. But God comes through because we've been faithful in tithing. And yes, we give back to the church as well too, because we're commanded. So there are 3 things that you can do today. There's 3 different sets of people. Some of us may need to start tithing, 10%. Some of us may need to remember why we started tithing in the first place. If you're been tithing, why do you tithe? That you need to go through that and figure out, why do I tithe? Why do I do this? And then the last group of people is some of us may need to just start pursuing justice, mercy, and faithfulness. That's the 3 options. That's your homework. Test God and start tithing. See what He does. Remember why we tithe. And if you've done those first 2 things, pursue justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Because God has commanded it from the beginning. Jesus commanded it. And He always comes through and He always multiplies.